Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Victoria with Redmond Mag, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. The topic of today's webcast is Cloud Migration and Maturity, a Framework to Data Freedom, sponsored by Veeam. Before we begin, just want to cover a few housekeeping details. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please make sure to type those into the Q&A box and we'll get them answered for you. Veeam has also provided some resources which do correspond with today's event, so take a moment to check those out. They're going to be located to the right of your audience console. Today's webcast is also being recorded, so make sure you keep an eye out for a link in your email to rewatch the presentation or to share it with a colleague. And now I am so thrilled to announce our speakers for today. We have the pleasure of hearing from Sam Nicholls, Director of Public Cloud Marketing at Veeam, and Michael Cade, Senior Technologist Product Strategy at Veeam. So we're in for a great event, and with that, I will pass the time over to Sam and Michael to get us started.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Victoria, for that warm welcome, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Definitely excited to talk to you about cloud migration and maturity and really kind of key in on this framework to data freedom. Like, what do we mean by data freedom? It's really about being as minimally prescriptive as possible as a vendor to enable you to host and protect your workloads across any infrastructure, whether that's physical, virtualized on-premises, whether that's in the cloud as a VM or a platform as a service, or even to more cloud mature or a more cloud mature model like containers and Kubernetes. Michael, any welcome words from you before we get started?
Yeah, no, I think Veeam has traditionally been known for that backup and that recovery swim lane, and actually the secret sauce behind Veeam, whether it be image-based backups on virtual, all the platforms that you mentioned, Sam, it's about being able to recover, about being able to move those workloads wherever they need to be, whether it is a disaster recovery type scenario, whether it's just to leverage that data somewhere else, or actually get some insight into that data. All of that freedom is a very interesting world that we're going to get into today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like the important thing is like it's not like we're looking to migrate each and every single one of our apps into the cloud. And what it's really landing us with is like this hybrid or multi-cloud notion. So this is from our data protection trends report. We run this every year. This is the latest set of data. If you haven't read it, do get your hands on it because there's some great information in there. But you know what's interesting to see is kind of at that COVID timeframe, we did see a big spike in moving workloads into the cloud, but we have balanced out over the course of time, right? So approximately a quarter of workloads are still within physical servers within the data center. Same for virtual machines, and about half of workloads are running in the cloud. But there's so many ways that you can run workloads in the cloud, and that's what the next part of this presentation is about. Is just like looking at all the different options that we have for application modernization, maturing in the cloud. And how can we actually get there? So first up, you know, the cloud isn't just a place to run VMs. There are multiple different ways that you can run in the cloud, which we've already discussed. But the first option, I guess, that you have when it comes to getting to the cloud is, do you just decide to retire the application or retain it as it is? Not all workloads make sense to run in the cloud, whether that's from a data sovereignty perspective, whether that's from a performance perspective, right? You want to keep the application, the data as close to the users as possible from a performance standpoint. Sometimes not everything needs to go to the cloud, and sometimes workloads are just going to be deprecated. So one of the first things is to always like remember is I don't have to move everything. So make sure that you do a good validation in terms of what your requirements are and whether it actually makes sense to run in the cloud. Next up is looking at repurchase models, right? So another way of phrasing this is drop and shop. So a good example of this is maybe Exchange on premises or Active Directory. You just drop that and go to an as a service model. So Microsoft 365 or maybe Entra ID. Michael, anything that you want to add around drop-in and shopping?
Yeah, I think it goes hand in hand with that retire and retain, right? You're either going to retain, maybe you're happy with the virtual machine infrastructure that you have on premises, or you're just happy with that regulation that I have to keep my data inside my own data center, for example. Or we're going to retire it and then we're going to repurchase. They're generally going to go either retire, it goes away completely, but generally you're going to retire something to then go into a repurchase, a SaaS-based model. We're seeing SaaS being the answer to everything across the board. We've noticed around like Microsoft 365 and Salesforce, because that's generally going to be the most important data that you probably have within your business. But obviously there's endless amounts of SaaS-based workloads and offerings out there across the industry. So they could kind of go hand in hand.
Absolutely. The next option that you have is looking at rehosting. So another term for this is lift and shift. So just the same way that we are running the application or workload on premises, we're just going to pick that up and run it on a virtual machine within AWS or Microsoft Azure or Google Cloud, or maybe even a sovereign cloud provider. So that traditional tightly coupled way of running applications, let's think of it like a 3-tier application, web layer, app layer, database, each of those running on their own individual VM. We're going to run that exactly the same way in the cloud. And you can absolutely do that. And that's often kind of the first way folks dip their toes in the water of running production in the cloud is lifting and shifting. But there are a number of other ways that you can run workloads in the cloud. Next is replatforming, so lifting, reshaping. We're starting to decouple that application and utilizing platform as a service offerings like databases or file shares. So there's an almost endless number of databases and file share platforms as a service available across the cloud providers. Michael, what would you say around replatforming workloads? So
just on the rehost, so the easy button is being able to go from maybe VMware into Azure virtual machines, because you are like Sam mentioned, we're just going to take that Windows server or that Linux server that we had on-prem, and we're just going to move that up into the public cloud. The important thing to note there is that what you're doing from where it was potentially on premises is that you were responsible within that data center for the physical hardware. You were probably responsible for the networking, the storage, and the compute, and keeping the lights on itself. When you go to rehost into one of the public clouds, you are paying the privilege for that to happen. But what you're also getting there is some scalability and some other features of that. You're paying a very different cost model. On-prem, you would have paid that CapEx model around 5 to 7 years and then sweat that asset. Now you're going into a pay-as-you-go type model within the public cloud, and that rehosting should be the start, or potentially that start of that journey. But we're seeing a lot of companies out there in the field, not just Veeam customers, this is industry-wide, where you get into that virtual machine layer and they go, oh, this cloud stuff's expensive. And they look to bring that back home because it was too expensive, or bring that back into a data center. What we need to think about is what that re-platform looks like, or what the next stars that we're going to cover as well. Because at that point, we reduce the overhead of our teams a little bit more, because with the virtual machines in the cloud, we still have to manage the operating system. We still have to do the Windows updates, for example. We still have to do the security to that using the VPC and the virtual networks. When we start to re-platform into things like RDS and EFS and DynamoDB and Azure SQL and all the endless PaaS-based solutions that we have out there in the cloud, we remove that overhead of having to look after that operating system. We're just going to consume the database or the data service, and from there, we're going to reshape how we're working with that. And initially, that looks like a cost model, but that's more expensive. But actually, it gives you the freedom to reuse your time, your team's time, to do more, to be able to offer more to the overall environment.
An absolute role, Michael, and I know that this is a place that you feel at home, right? Is around re-architecting or refactoring workloads, so fully decoupling that application and going towards something that's more containerized. And this is the world that you've been living and breathing for a number of years. So why don't you talk to us about refactoring workloads?
Yeah, and the way this diagram is built out, it makes it look like, oh, we've got to determine the migration path, and maybe we're all in on VMware or Hyper-V or some sort of on-prem virtualization solution, and we're at this crossroad where we have to think, oh, we're going to rehost, or we're going to re-platform, or we're going to repurchase, or we're going to refactor. That's not necessarily like we might we might start with that rehost, but then we're going to determine a migration path from that rehosting, and then we start thinking about the other R's as well. So it's a continuous journey on that migration path. But yeah, to that refactoring, I've been living in the world of DevOps, platform engineering, and really around containerization and Kubernetes over the last 3 years. And there is no, before we had from physical to virtual, we had that P2V path. We had a lot of good software that would enable us to be able to do that. We don't necessarily have that virtual to container. And then we also don't have that commercial off-the-shelf software completely or fully available today. So where we are creating software out there in the industry, where everyone's a software development house, this refactor allows us to start off with that containerization. It allows us to go from version 1 to version 2 very quickly and adapt to what that needs to look like. It means that we can scale up quickly. The footprint that we use within the cloud is very minimal. We could then even start thinking about, so I've mentioned around Kubernetes, but it could also be serverless. Those databases that we previously mentioned, there's some that are available from a serverless architecture as well. All of that refactoring just means that we could be a little bit more mobile where and when we need to run that, and manageability of that. So none of these paths are, this is the path I'm taking and I'm going to stick to it. All of them are door open. They're all open from day one. And it's a choice, but to just rehost and think that I'm in the cloud and everything's going to be great, probably need to reconsider what that needs to look like, because otherwise the big bill that comes from AWS or Microsoft is going to be substantial, and you're going to have to then think about returning or at least refactoring and replatforming that workload.
Lots of R's. We promised lots of R's, I guess, in the webinar preview, right? We promised 10 R's, and I think we've covered 6 of them, right? Retire, retain, rehost, replatform, repurchase, refactor. One that's not on here is relocate. So this is just going with like a VMware cloud flavor, right? Whether that's VMware cloud on AWS. There is that choice that you have as well. But we do want to introduce 3 other R's that you should always be cognizant of, irrespective of where you are in your cloud maturity, however you're choosing to migrate and operate workloads on public cloud infrastructure. And those 3 other R's are resiliency, recovery, and responsibility, right? I think one of the big things that people misunderstand when they move to the cloud is, I am transitioning all of that responsibility for that data to that public cloud provider. So I no longer need to protect and secure my data. That is their responsibility. And it's simply not true, right? There's all 3 major cloud providers. In fact, most cloud providers have their own shared responsibility model. It might be called a model, it might be called a matrix. But the idea behind this is to help you understand, as you transition to the cloud, irrespective of what model, whether it's infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, you are transitioning varying degrees of responsibility to the cloud provider, but you always retain some responsibility yourself. So as we move to infrastructure as a service, this is AWS's shared responsibility model. You can see here in the blue what you are transitioning to them. But that customer data, that is your data. It is your responsibility to architect the environment properly. It is your responsibility to ensure resilience of that data through things like replication, backup, recovery. So don't fall into that pitfall of, I don't need to protect my data, or I'm operating in a container and I don't need to back that data up. Whether that data service lives inside the container, inside the cluster or outside the cluster, you always need to be protecting your data. Michael, anything to add around shared responsibility?
Yeah, just to really double down on that, is that the cloud providers, and obviously this is AWS's, Microsoft have the same, as you said, Sam, but they're going to keep the lights on. If you look at AWS, they're going to give you anywhere up to 16 nines of availability and ultimately resilience if you pay for it. But that's just the infrastructure. They're going to give you the access to the compute, the storage, the databases, the services that they derive across multiple regions, across multiple availability zones, and all of that good stuff. But ultimately, if you're using IaaS and that operating system, that Windows server that you're running as an EC2 instance, if you patch that, or maybe it's a piece of software running on that, and you make an accidental mistake on there, well, that's going to be on you, right? That there's no number to call at AWS to go, oh, I've just upgraded my Windows machine and now it's not working. That it's on you, and this is really where this responsibility model comes from. Is about like anything that is in your control, and customer data being the top of the tree here, then it's your responsibility. Now, don't get me wrong, like I mentioned, with refactoring that into things like Amazon RDS, they're going to take away that responsibility of the operating system, so you don't have to worry about patching that. But now you're not in control of that particular version of operating system. You're just going to consume a Postgres database, a particular version, and that's all your control. That's the only control that you have on that. Sam, if you just go back to the last screen as well, I just wanted to this in particular, the R's that we touched on before we got to these three new ones. This is not, we've not just made this up. This comes from a long-standing blog and a continued blog from AWS actually, where they talk about. Initially, they talk about 6 R's, and then they added another one. And they talk about all of the things that we've spoken about. We've just made it cloud agnostic, really about where data comes into play here. And then, like we mentioned, resiliency is really making sure you can purchase resiliency at different levels when it comes to the public clouds. So if we use Azure, for example, on a particular storage account, you can have LRS, you can have GRS, you can have ZRS. Like there's endless amounts of resilience that you can pay for, and that ultimately means how many copies of the data am I going to spread across multiple storage constructs within the public cloud. However, that is going to replicate. If you make a bad mistake on that storage one, it's going to replicate to all those other storages. So resilience, the storage is resilient, but resiliency doesn't mean backup and recovery. It doesn't mean data protection, which is why we added in recovery and that responsibility, because recovery is obviously important. B doesn't start with an R, so we couldn't add that. But ultimately, backup and recovery is very important to that whole overarching reliability of the public cloud. There's another R there, Sam. Yeah,
so many
I just wanted to clear that up.
Thank you. All right, so we've established that people are moving to the cloud. Hybrid multi-cloud is absolutely a reality now, and there's multiple different ways that you can migrate and modernize on the public cloud. And irrespective of what path you choose to take, whether it is lift and shift, drop and shop, refactoring, reshaping, you are responsible for the data. You are responsible for protecting that data. So what are some of the best ways that you can go about protecting that data outside of, kind of what Michael was just mentioning around different like local redundancy, zone redundancy, geo redundancy? What are some of the other ways that you can do that, particularly when it comes to backup and recovery? So first off is just understanding the 3-2-1 rule. The 3-2-1 rule actually started off in photography. It was started off by a photographer and said, you got to have 3 different copies of your data, 2 different media, 1 offsite. And that transitioned very, very well into the data center, and it absolutely transitions well into the public cloud as well, right? So in terms of how that might look, you've got your production copy. Okay, that's your first copy. A lot of folks will then take a snapshot of that, right? So let's just say it's an EC2 instance. I'm going to take an EBS snapshot because the EBS volume is attached to that EC2 instance. I'm going to take that EBS snapshot and I'm going to stop there. Well, that's only 2 different copies and they're on the same type of media. What you want to do is then take an image-based backup and then store that off-site away from the production workload. Now, off-site doesn't necessarily have to mean outside of that public cloud provider, although it absolutely could be. It's often storing that snapshot on a different type of media, usually object storage, right? So in AWS, we've got S3, we've got Azure Blob, we've got Google Cloud Storage. We want to store that in a different availability zone or a different region, particularly if that is a highly valuable set of data or application. Storing in a different region is critical because we We know that regions do sometimes go down, irrespective of how many nines of availability there are. Just making sure that you have those 3 different copies: production, snapshot, image-based backup, 2 different types of media, EBS volume, S3, the equivalent of AWS for Azure, and then for Google Cloud, and 1 off-site, particularly getting it away from the original account and sometimes away from that original location. Michael, anything to add on the 3-2-1 rule?
Yeah, I think your mention of the account is very important, because if you think about where the attack vector or the attack surface lies, it's going to be on the account. So being able to have another account within the same public cloud might be an option, and then storing that in an immutable backup location, namely using object lock within AWS S3 or Azure Blob immutability as well. Equally, in the news just the last couple of weeks, you've seen Google and you've seen AWS really come out with that egress charge limitation being lifted a little. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure if you read the small print, there's some hurdles that you still need to go through, but that then opens up the door for that cross-cloud capability about being able to store that backup into other areas, so that you could then maybe start that mobility story about where you then recover if those nines do fail and you do have to recover somewhere else. But not always about recovery. How can I leverage it somewhere else as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that you mentioned the lifting of the egress fees. Absolutely a lot of terms and conditions there to meet. And by no means would I say that those allow for consistent egress like in a backup and recovery situation. But there are ways that you can get cross-cloud backup and recovery without paying for things like egress. So you can use things like ExpressRoute or Direct Connect, and that treats it as cross-regional traffic instead of egress. And we've got a number of customers that do that. Ciox Health is one of the healthcare technology providers here in the United States. They deal with a lot of medical records, and they use Veeam. And they use Veeam in the capacity of co-location, AWS, and Azure. Co-location backs up to AWS, AWS backs up to Azure, Azure backs up to AWS. And ultimately, they keep their data protection bill very, very small by utilizing a number of Veeam technologies to help keep the cost of backup and the associated storage low, but also that direct connect and express route approach to do that cross-cloud backup without breaking the bank on egress fees. This is just a diagrammatic example of how the 3-2-1 rule would look. So as I mentioned, you got your production data set. Maybe that's an RDS instance, maybe it's an EC2 instance. We take that snapshot, there's our second copy, but it's on the same type of media. And then we take that back up and we'll store it in object storage. So again, in this case, it's S3. And again, doing that across accounts is very, very critical. And that kind of leads us nicely onto the next one, which is this notion of a logical air gap, right? Now, we've been dealing with air gaps for a long, long time. I can remember dealing with tapes going off to Iron Mountain, right? We've got that air gap. It's no longer connected to the system. But how do we do that in the public cloud where everything's constantly connected to a network? We have to switch to this notion of logical air gaps versus physical air gaps. And this is really what Michael and I were talking about, right? It's that dedicated backup account in AWS. It's a subscription in Azure. It's a project in Google. Having that dedicated backup account, not leveraging the production account or accounts to not just host the data protection solution, but host the actual repository as well. Michael, anything around logical air gapping?
Yeah, just to hopefully try and paint a picture around this. So think about a completely separate AWS or an Azure subscription that punches a hole into the production AWS account or into another subscription within Azure or a project within Google, but you're defining access into that to only the resources that you need, so namely potentially the EBS snapshot, and being very granular around what that IAM needs to look like, the identity and access management of that. So you're defining what that needs to be, what region it needs to be, and then what protection needs to happen from that. Hopefully that would help visualize what we're seeing on the screen here around the different accounts and the layers in which we have that. I've gone ahead and started talking about IAM already.
That's all right. We'll just keep going, Michael. It's all good. IAM is all about, principle of least privilege, right? It's a fundamental tenet of this zero trust principle, whereby it's not just the users, but like apps and other services only have the necessary permissions to perform their role and no more. So yes, you have that dedicated account, but if you leave the door wide open and someone has already negotiated access into the production environment, they'll likely easily be able to negotiate that access then into that dedicated backup. So utilizing things like the granular IAM permissions on a service by service basis is critical. So they only have access to the task, the minimal set of roles and responsibilities to perform the task that they need to, no more, no less. Those permissions need to be continuously audited. They need to be rotated, and anything that's unnecessary needs to be deleted. So principle of least privilege, IAM roles, very, very critical. Also leveraging other access constructs as well. So things like role-based access control to the backup solution. So do we want, let's just say, an application developer having administrative access to the data protection solution? Probably not. We want them to be able to self-service for restores, but do we want them going and changing backup settings or changing the configuration of the backup solution itself or changing the policies? Probably not, because that's going to have data protection compliance implications. But making sure that we leverage role-based access control, assign those granular permissions to what that person needs to do. So again, application developer probably just needs restore access for self-service, and then multi-factor authentication as well. So helping prevent things like man-in-the-middle attacks, brute force attacks, something that password, something that you have, usually authenticated on a device. Michael, I know we've got ahead of yourself with the IAM, but anything to add here?
Yeah, so I think the zero trust, everyone's talking about it. I think even if you're not going to the public cloud, there's a part to play in this. Even if you're staying on premises, have a look at that Active Directory or whatever authentication model that you're currently using. I've been a sysadmin. I know how easy it is to unlock the door for everyone and everything. That God mode type look. The biggest action you could take away from this is to go and look at that model that you have and think about that zero trust. Let's really scale back. Let's have people ask for that permission to get into that service. Because if you start practicing that now before you get to the cloud journey, then that will make that understanding of AWS IAM or Entra ID within Azure a lot simpler when it comes to locking things down and making sure that people only have the right access. You don't want to start on the foot of, we're just going to give everyone access to begin with, because we all know how that's going to end up. Everyone's going to have access, and yeah, we're never going to scale back. We're never going to really get to that true zero trust.
Absolutely. All right. Next, we've got two more best practices, I guess we can call them, for you, and this one's around immutability. So I think everyone knows what immutability at this point, but for those that don't, it's just placing backups in that write once, read many state. So once that backup, whether it's a full or an incremental, has been committed to that storage, it cannot be changed, amended, deleted, encrypted, modified until a specific, often time-based duration has occurred. And this is really critical because, ransomware evolved from, okay, we're going to go in and we're going to encrypt the production data set, and I'm going to hold you ransom. I'm not going to let you get that back unless you pay my ransom. So instead of paying ransom, organizations decided to just start restoring from a backup. And the attackers caught on to that, and then backups are now the primary target of ransomware attacks. So what did we do in place of that? We started to make it immutable, so they cannot encrypt and hold that data ransom. We can still ensure a successful and clean recovery, right? We've got coming back to this of recovery. So making sure that you define retention periods is critical, right? If you've got compliance requirements around you've got to keep data for, let's say, 7 years, you want to make sure that you set that immutability period for 7 years, not less, not more, because if it's more, you're not going to be able to delete it, and that might put you in breach of compliance for retaining data too long. But making sure that you set those periods, and again, leveraging things like S3 object lock, Azure has a similar notion when it comes to placing objects in an immutable state. Michael, anything to add around immutability before we get onto the next evolution of ransomware and what you should be doing?
Yeah, so there's a lot of, and this is probably the second call to action, because immutability, we talk a lot about S3 because we're talking about cloud and we're talking about cloud migrations. But ultimately, if you're running backups on premises, then you should make sure that the one of that 321 should be on some sort of immutable storage, even locally, whether it be S3 or Linux have built-in command sets that allow you to achieve this as well. So that's another action. Make sure that one of those copies is an immutable copy of that, because if it's immutable, not only does it protect against those cyber threats, those ransomware, the topical stuff that we see in the news every day, but equally, we have malicious users, and people make mistakes. I want to make sure that my data is just not accidentally deleted by some admin that has access wrongly to that S3 bucket or to that backup repository. So having immutability really just gives us that extra protection when it comes to storing that one copy of offsite backup data.
All right. And then the final one is around encryption, right? Because as these attacks, these bad actors evolve their strategies, and we combat that by having 3 copies of our data, 2 different types of media, one offsite. It's stored in a separate account that's logically air-gapped. It is, we ensure the principle of least privilege, so people can have a very, very hard time accessing it. If they do access it, it's immutable, so they can't encrypt it. What those attacks have evolved to is now exfiltration attempts, right? So they take the sensitive data, maybe that's PHI, PII, that lives in backups. They're going to export it, save it on some storage, and then they'll hold you ransom for that and say that they'll leak this data if you do not pay the ransom. So what you want to also do is make sure that that data is always encrypted, both in flight and at rest. So even if they do negotiate access to absolutely everything, it's very, very hard for them to exfiltrate this data. And there's a number of different services available, things like AWS, KMS, Azure Key Vault, to help make that encryption task much, much easier for you. Many different options when it comes to things like default keys, customer managed keys. But just like with IAM roles, make sure that you rotate those keys routinely and that you delete any unused keys or unnecessary keys. Michael, anything to add around encryption?
So yeah, this is just another layer that we add onto protecting those workloads. So being able to encrypt and carry that key or offload that key management responsibility to a service that AWS and Azure clearly have, but equally, and I'll talk about the Kubernetes side of things with Kasten at the moment, is we have the ability to integrate into things like HashiCorp Vault, as well as then VBR has the ability, so Veeam Backup and Replication has the ability to integrate into some KMIP type KMS systems as well, version 2 of the API, all of that good stuff. And that's really about just adding that extra layer of making sure that data is encrypted on that immutable target as well, so that if anyone was to, firstly, they're going to try and encrypt it or delete it. They can't do that. It cannot be changed because of that write once, read many. Then they're going to try and exfiltrate that and take a copy of that, which you could, in theory, do from an immutable copy. You could take a copy, but if we're encrypting, then we're adding that layer on top, which enforces them, well, now you need the key to get into the car or into the data, sorry. And this should be a de facto. We should make sure that this guardrail is put in place to make sure that is always on from that perspective.
Absolutely. All right, so I'm going to start to bring it home now, and we'll get to some Q&A in a bit, but really just wanted to tie everything up. Michael and I have tried to take a vendor-agnostic approach, right? We didn't want to come in with a sales pitch. We wanted to come and give you some best practices around what options that you have when it comes to modernizing your applications, migrating to the cloud, and just really giving you some best practices when it comes to ensuring that data is as resilient and recoverable as possible, whether you're using Veeam or another solution. When it comes to a Veeam perspective, though, we support all of these different platforms, right? We have a huge portfolio able to support a varying number of physical workloads on premises, a number of virtualized workloads on premises, as well as in the public cloud, right? Whether it's IaaS virtual machines, whether it's platform as a service databases, file shares, or whether you're going containerized with Kubernetes. Veeam is going to be with you every step of the way. And that's huge from a data freedom perspective, because backup is now not a hurdle, or data protection is now not a hurdle to adopting these latest and most modern ways of running applications. And it's not just a hurdle, but we're an enabler of that as well, right? We are completely platform agnostic. If you want to go physical to virtual one day, absolutely. You don't need to pick up the phone. You don't need to buy a new piece of software. You don't need to buy a new license. Same when you go to the cloud. Maybe you over-rotated to the cloud and wanted to bring some stuff back on-prem. We're never going to be prescriptive when it comes to how you move your data. So not only are we giving you that technological tool set to help you move that data, because a migration is really just a planned recovery, but we're also giving you we're not putting the licensing hurdles or procurement hurdles in the way either, right? It is one platform, one set of licenses to help you protect your data, irrespective of where it lives, and really, modernize your apps. So let's get to the Q&A, unless you have anything else to add to that, Michael.
No, I think that's all good. Hopefully that was clear enough for everyone as well. Yeah, just to really highlight on that is that from a Veeam point of view, obviously we start off with that backup and recovery. There's a lot of data security concepts that I just touched on as well. We hit that immutability, we hit that encryption, but equally it's about mobility. How can we enable you to, maybe it's a migration story, but maybe it's just what does that application actually look like up in the public cloud? So we want to take advantage of directly restoring from an image-based backup and getting that into a public cloud setting, which then actually leads us to the first question: why is the cloud not just a backup target or a place to run VMs so much more? Sam, I don't know if you want to take that question first, and then I've got something to add after.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, backup is always or often a storage intensive task, right? So a lot of folks looked to the cloud, especially when we're dealing with like the supply chain issues in that COVID era. People weren't able to get their hands on storage. They had this growing need for data storage, and the cloud providers gave an option, right? So folks were still running their workloads on premises and choosing the cloud as a backup target, and absolutely do so, right? The storage is infinitely scalable. It's very, very durable. It can be very, very cost effective, right? Some of the storage options, like archive storage classes, are literally fractions of a cent per gigabyte per month. But the cloud is so much more, right? There's hundreds and hundreds of different services up there, again, ranging from just virtual machines, if you want to lift and shift, to many, many different platform as a service option, PaaS options, like databases, file shares. So as you mature more, you start to decouple your applications and adopt more and more of these platform as a service, software as a service options. The cloud really offers it all, and they're constantly evolving, constantly changing. And like Michael said at the beginning, you kind of move more towards the PaaS and SaaS. You are offloading so much management and maintenance off of yourself to be more efficient in developing better applications versus just managing infrastructure.
Absolutely. So the conversation I have, Sam, on that is we're generally thinking about. Like I would say that the opportunity or the option today, if you're all on-prem and you're in a data center or several data centers, normally like around that on-premises virtualization suite of products, then the best option to start consuming and also opening the door to recovery options, maybe reducing having to have a DR site in the more traditional sense, by being able to send your data or backups to the cloud, to that object storage location, opens up the door to then, okay, that means it's already up there so that I can leverage direct restore functionality to get that into virtual machines up there if a bad thing was to happen, if and when something, maybe a cyber threat or some sort of accident or some fire, flood and bloods type scenario happens. That gives you the opportunity. The data's already there. It's going to be a much quicker orchestrated process at that point. Then I'll add that, okay, now then you've got within the cloud, and this is starting to talk about those Azure or those AWS virtual machines, leveraging those and re-architecting them into more cloud native type workloads. So we're there for a certain amount of time before we're able to re-architect or re-platform that. And then you've got the cloud native. So you've got three options of, okay, I'm going to get my backup data up there first. Then I'm going to maybe start moving some tertiary services and servers up there so that I can break down the four walls of the data center, which is exactly what we saw during the pandemic, is that, oh, I don't have everyone in the same office as my servers now. So I need to now think about latency. I need to think about performance for all those home workers. And then you've got the re-architecture. How do I get it into the cloud native, the Kubernetes, the containerization? Even the PaaS-based RDS is considered as a cloud native approach. So those three things, I'd be thinking about that as a strategy within the IT.
Absolutely. All right. We got another question. Sorry, were you going to say something, Michael?
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the questions, mate. So.
Oh, yeah, okay, let's go. So when it comes to resiliency and recovery, who's responsible for that architecture? Again, it's a shared responsibility, right? As you move workloads into the public cloud, the cloud provider is going to be responsible for the hardware, right? The infrastructure. And if, as Michael said, as you move towards more cloud native ways of doing things like PaaS, you are transitioning some of that responsibility to the provider, right? Like the operating system. But ultimately that data is still yours and you are responsible for ensuring its resiliency and the ability to recover it, right? And like Michael said, you can choose to have multiple different copies of that data through things like local redundancy. I think that's 3 copies. There's geo redundancy and zonal redundancy. Yes, but that's based on replication. And if that first bit of data goes bad, it's going to be replicated no matter how many different copies that you have. So you need to have a standalone copy of that data in line with that 3-2-1 rule that we spoke about. And that's really kind of where, making sure that you have a cloud native backup solution that can leverage things like snapshots, but as well as image-based backups is absolutely critical. So irrespective of what happens, you are able to recover.
I think to add to that is, well, firstly, it's great that you're asking that question, so you're mindful of that, and ask that for every single service that you're consuming. Ask who's responsible for the resiliency or the recovery of that. And if the public cloud says no, then clearly that lands on your head to do that. And I think it's very different between IaaS, PaaS, and even SaaS at that point, right? So from a resiliency point of view, we've only really touched on IaaS and PaaS. When it gets into SaaS-based workloads, such as Microsoft 365, there's no database that you now look after, but the data is still yours. The mailboxes, the items within your inbox, the Teams, the OneDrive, all of those files, they're going to provide that resiliency, but the recovery is going to have to come from you, or Microsoft natively, they're going to bring back everything and they're literally going to dump everything back into your inbox. So if you've got 5,000 items in your inbox, you're going to get all 5,000 back, even though you probably only need one or two things. So it's about asking that question and having that top of mind. It's not always it's not always top of mind. Backup is generally always left to last. It's the insurance policy, but equally, it's the most important part of any project, is making sure that when bad things happen, and they will, is how do I get out of this bad situation, whatever that bad may be.
Absolutely. All right, final question is, what are air gap backups and why is logical versus a physical approach necessary for implementation? So I think, again, we covered the notion of an air gap backup. It's just making sure that copy of data is disconnected from the network. So, tape, I mentioned tape as a past thing, but tape's not dead, right? Tape is probably one of the most, if not the most, immutable type of storage, because we can truly physically disconnect it from a network, and we can ship it off to a place like Iron Mountain if we choose. But again, in the public cloud, where we don't own that hardware, we have no control over that hardware, how do I achieve that air gap? So we have to move to that logical notion, which we discussed earlier. So again, making sure
I think that's important though, Sam, to touch on, because so I get asked quite a lot from big enterprises, well, I need that to go to tape. There is a regulation in the financial institutions or government, Fed, SLED, etc., that demands that I need to have a copy of that data on some sort of tape media. And so from a Veeam perspective, we have the ability to get that to tape, but it obviously has to come out of the cloud to do that. So as much as that one copy off-site can be object storage, it equally can go off to that tape or to another storage device that acts like a tape maybe as well. So there's always options, and to be asking that question, tape, as Sam said, tapes are 100% not dead. I see them innovating actually on how much space they can cram into those media types as well. So they're very much still an option. They're also regulated, so we have to have the ability to send our data to tape, and we also need to have, because one thing when you send that data to tape, we have to be very considerate about how to recover that workload from that tape, and we've done some amazing work about how fast we can recover from it. I actually didn't think I'd mention tape that much on a cloud migration session, but hopefully that was useful.
Love tape, right? All right, well, there was a number of other questions that came through that Michael and I have got to while we were in the discussion as well. So thank you so much for all of the questions. Thank you for joining us today as well. Michael, any parting comments from you before we hand it back to Victoria?
No, just have them think about those R's, and namely those three that we covered. So the responsibility, whose responsibility is it? What does the recovery look like of that data if bad things happen, which they will? And then also who's in charge of that resilience? One of the questions, exactly that. When it comes to resiliency and recovery, who is responsible? If everyone on the call can think about that, then me and Sam have done our job, whether you're using Veeam or not.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Thank you, everyone. And back to you, Victoria.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sam and Michael, for being with us today. That is all the time we have. But a big thank you to the audience for attending today's webcast. And of course, a special thank you to Veeam for sponsoring today's event presented by Redmond Mag. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone.